This 1854 daguerreotype looks charming until you notice the boy's chain. This 1854 daguerreotype looks charming until you notice the boy's chain. It seemed like every other childhood portrait from antebellum Virginia: two boys, small wooden toys, the soft blur of an old exposure. A curator at the Virginia Historical Society thought she had seen it all. But one detail in the lower corner of this image refused to let her go. Her name was Eleanor Marsh. She was 53 years old and had spent the last 27 of them cataloging photographs, tintypes, and daguerreotypes for the Society's permanent collection. She had processed thousands of images from the 1840s through the early 1900s: soldiers in their first uniforms, brides in borrowed lace, businessmen standing rigid beside potted ferns. She knew how to read the visual grammar of 19th century portraiture. She understood what posture signaled about class, what clothing revealed about aspiration, what backdrops implied about regional identity. This particular daguerreotype arrived in a batch of materials from the estate of a family in Henrico County. The family, descendants of tobacco planters, had finally sold their ancestral property after the last surviving heir died without children. A nephew in California had no interest in keeping the house or its contents. He signed everything over to an auction company, which separated the furniture from the documents, the silver from the photographs. The Historical Society acquired several boxes of paper materials and a handful of cased images. Eleanor opened the first case on a Tuesday morning in late October. The image inside measured roughly 3 inches by 4 inches, housed in a hinged leather case lined with faded velvet. The daguerreotype itself was in remarkable condition: no tarnish at the edges, no foxing on the plate. The silver surface still held a crisp reflection when tilted toward the light. The composition showed 2 boys seated on a low wooden bench. The boy on the left was white, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, dressed in a fine wool jacket with brass buttons. His hair was neatly parted and oiled. He held a small carved horse in his right hand. The boy on the right was black, approximately the same age, wearing simpler clothes but still presentable: a white cotton shirt and dark trousers. He held a wooden top and a length of string. Both boys looked directly at the camera with the fixed stare required by long exposure times. Their knees almost touched. The framing suggested intimacy, companionship, a kind of boyhood friendship frozen in silver and glass. Eleanor had seen this type of image before. Companion portraits, they were sometimes called in collection catalogs. Images showing enslaved children posed alongside the white children they were assigned to attend. The practice was more common than most people realized. Wealthy families in the antebellum South often acquired enslaved children specifically to serve as playmates and body servants for their own sons. The arrangement began in early childhood and continued into adolescence. The enslaved child learned to anticipate the white child's needs, to carry his books, to sleep at the foot of his bed, to absorb punishment that might otherwise fall on young master's shoulders. These photographs were typically staged to suggest harmony. The composition implied equality, even affection. Families kept them as evidence of their benevolence, their civilizing influence, the supposed contentment of the people they held in bondage. Eleanor began the standard documentation process. She noted the dimensions, the case material, the condition of the plate. She searched for any inscription on the velvet lining or the paper backing. She found initials scratched into the brass mat, WHB, and below that, in smaller letters, Claybornne. She was about to move on to the next item when something caught her eye. She tilted the plate again, adjusting the angle to catch the overhead lamp. There was something at the collar of the black child's shirt, a thin line barely visible, catching a glint of light in a way that fabric would not. She reached for her magnifying glass. The line resolved into a series of small links, a chain, not decorative, not part of any garment, a thin metal chain disappearing beneath the boy's collar on both sides, encircling his neck. The chain was positioned so that it was almost entirely hidden by the shirt's fabric. Only a small section, perhaps half an inch, was visible where the collar gaped slightly. If the boy had shifted his chin down, or if the shirt had been fastened higher, the chain would have been completely invisible. But the long exposure had frozen everything precisely as it was. And now, 170 years later, Eleanor was staring at evidence of something the photograph was never meant to reveal. This was not just a charming portrait of childhood friendship. This was an image of captivity, dressed up in the visual language of companionship. The enslaved boy had been restrained even as he posed with his toy. The family had wanted a picture of two playmates. What they had preserved was proof of bondage. Eleanor set down her magnifying glass. Her hands were trembling slightly. After 27 years, she thought she had become inured to the cruelties embedded in these old images. But this one was different. The deliberate staging, the false innocence of the composition, the hidden restraint. It all amounted to something that felt less like historical documentation and more like evidence from a crime scene. She knew she could not simply catalog this image and move on. Whatever story lay behind this daguerreotype, whatever system had produced it, whatever happened to the boy in the chain, she needed to find out. Eleanor had not always worked in archives. Before joining the Historical Society, she had completed a doctorate in American history at the University of Virginia, focusing on material culture in the 19th century Chesapeake. Her dissertation examined how objects, specifically clothing, furniture, and household goods, functioned as markers of social status in the decades before the Civil War. She had spent years learning to read the subtle codes embedded in physical artifacts, the cut of a coat, the weave of a textile, the finish on a piece of silver. She had also learned to recognize what was missing. Enslaved people were often invisible in the material record, their presence acknowledged only through absences and silences. An inventory might list one Negro boy, age approximately 8, alongside furniture and livestock without ever recording his name. A diary might mention the children playing in the garden without specifying which children could leave and which could not. Photography changed that, but only partially. The daguerreotype process, introduced in the United States in 1839, was expensive and time-consuming. Only wealthy families could afford to sit for portraits in the early decades. When enslaved people appeared in these images, it was almost always at the direction of their enslavers, in poses that served the visual narrative of the white family. Eleanor had seen hundreds of such images: enslaved nursemaids holding white infants, enslaved men standing behind their masters' chairs, enslaved children positioned as props, accessories, evidence of wealth. The poses were always carefully controlled. The enslaved subjects were never the focus. They existed in the frame only to demonstrate something about the white subjects: prosperity, authority, benevolence. But she had never seen a chain. She returned to the daguerreotype the next morning with a digital microscope. The device allowed her to magnify the image significantly without touching the fragile surface. She moved slowly across the plate, examining every detail. The chain was even more visible under magnification. It appeared to be made of small oval links, each perhaps a quarter-inch long. The metal had a dull finish, suggesting iron rather than silver or brass. The chain was thin enough to be concealed by clothing, but sturdy enough to resist a child's strength. She also noticed something else. The black boy's hands, holding the toy top and string, were positioned in an unusual way. His wrists were close together, even though the pose did not require it. She looked more carefully and saw faint shadows around both wrists. The image was not sharp enough to confirm it, but it appeared that his hands might also have been bound. She photographed the daguerreotype from multiple angles, creating a digital record that could be enhanced and analyzed. Then, she carefully removed the image from its case to examine the backing. Behind the brass mat, she found a small slip of paper, folded twice. The paper was brittle and yellowed, but the handwriting was still legible. It read, "William Henry Barksdale and his boy Claybornne, November 1854. Richmond." His boy. Not his friend, not his companion. His boy. Claybornne was property. Eleanor knew the Barksdale name. The family had been prominent in Virginia politics before the war. Several Barksdales had served in the state legislature. One had been a Confederate general. Their plantation, Elm Grove, had been one of the largest in Henrico County. She also knew that the Barksdale family papers were held at the Virginia Historical Society. She had processed some of them herself, years earlier. Now she would need to return to those documents with new questions. What was the chain for? Why was an 8-year-old child in restraints during what should have been a routine portrait session? and what had happened to Claybornne after the photograph was taken. Eleanor began with the Richmond city directories from the 1850s. The daguerreotype had been made in Richmond, and she wanted to identify the photographer. Most portrait studios in this period included their name or studio stamp somewhere on the case or mat, but the Barksdale daguerreotype had no such marking. The initials WHB referred to the white subject, not the photographer. She cross-referenced the directories with surviving advertisements from Richmond newspapers. By 1854, there were at least a dozen daguerreotype studios operating in the city. Several had left behind substantial archives. Eleanor focused on studios that were known to have photographed wealthy families, particularly those with documented connections to the plantation elite. After 2 weeks of searching, she found a match. A studio operated by a photographer named Marcus Aurelius Pryor had used the same style of leather case and brass mat. Pryor's daybook, which survived in the collections of the Library of Virginia, included an entry for November 12, 1854. Barksdale, Henrico Co., 2 boys, $5. $5 was a significant sum, but not unusual for a daguerreotype of this quality. What was unusual was the notation Pryor had added in the margin: restraint required for second subject. Eleanor read the line 3 times, restraint required. The photographer had noted it as a matter of practical concern, like adjusting the lighting or positioning a headrest. He had not questioned it. He had simply recorded it. She began looking for other references to Pryor's practices. His studio had been located on Main Street, in the commercial heart of Richmond. He had advertised in the Richmond Enquirer and the Daily Dispatch. His clientele included some of the most prominent families in Virginia. He had photographed governors, legislators, and military officers. She also found, buried in a collection of uncatalogued receipts at the Library of Virginia, an inventory of Pryor's studio equipment from 1858. Among the cameras, chemicals, backdrops, and furniture, the inventory listed various restraints for subjects, including children's items. Eleanor contacted Dr. Miriam Foster, a historian at Howard University who specialized in the visual culture of slavery. Dr. Foster had written extensively about how enslaved people were represented and misrepresented in antebellum photography. Eleanor shared the digitized images and the documentation she had found. Dr. Foster's response came within hours. "This is significant," she wrote. "We know that photographers used restraints to keep subjects still during long exposures, head clamps, arm supports, back braces. But I have never seen documentation of restraints used specifically to control enslaved children in portrait sittings. This suggests a level of coercion that has not been fully documented in the scholarly literature." She added a warning. The Barksdale family may have descendants who will not welcome this interpretation. Companion portraits have long been read as evidence of affection, even equality, between enslaved and free children. Reframing this image as evidence of restraint will challenge a mythology that some people are deeply invested in preserving. Eleanor turned next to the Barksdale family papers. The collection filled 12 archival boxes and included correspondence, legal documents, financial records, and personal diaries. She had processed the collection years earlier, but she had not been looking for Claybornne. Now she was. She found him in a plantation ledger from 1850. Under the heading Inventory of Negroes, the entry read, "Claybornne, male, born approxi. 1846, purchased 1852 from estate of J. Randolph, $400. Assigned to young Master William as body servant and companion. Purchased at age 6. Assigned to a boy 2 years his senior." The language was clinical, bureaucratic. It reduced a child to a line item in an account book. Eleanor found more references in the correspondence. Martha Barksdale, William's mother, wrote to her sister in December 1852. "We have acquired a small Negro boy to attend William. He is spirited but will be trained. William is already much attached to him and insists they share everything, toys, meals, even his bed. I confess I find it charming, though of course the boy must learn his place." Learn his place. Eleanor noted the phrase. She had seen it before in similar contexts. It meant that Clayborne's natural resistance to enslavement would be systematically broken. His spirit would be punished out of him. A later letter from March 1854 suggested that this process was not going smoothly. Martha wrote, "Claybornne continues to be difficult. He refuses to submit to William's authority and has twice attempted to leave the property. Mr. Barksdale has ordered more stringent measures. The boy now wears a small chain at all times, which can be secured to William's belt or to the furniture as needed. It grieves me to see such measures necessary, but we cannot have defiance in the household." There it was. The chain was not an accident of the photograph, it was policy. Claybornne was kept in permanent restraints because he would not stop trying to escape. 8 years old, and he had already tried to run twice. Eleanor needed to understand the broader system that had produced this photograph. The practice of assigning enslaved children as companions to white children was widespread in the antebellum South, but it had never been systematically studied. She began reaching out to other scholars, archivists, and museum professionals who might have encountered similar materials. Dr. James Okonkwo, a historian at the College of William and Mary, had spent years documenting the experiences of enslaved children in Virginia. He agreed to meet with Eleanor at Elm Grove, the former Barksdale plantation, which was now operated as a historic site by a private foundation. The main house had been preserved in its antebellum configuration. The foundation had restored the parlor, the dining room, and several bedrooms to their 1850s appearance. Tours emphasized the architectural details, the decorative arts, and the family's contributions to Virginia history. The enslaved people who had lived and worked there were mentioned briefly, almost as an afterthought. Dr. Okonkwo met Eleanor on the front porch. "I have been to this site 3 times, he said. "Each time I've asked about the enslaved community. Each time I've been told that records are limited and the focus is on the architecture. It is a familiar story." They walked the grounds together. The original slave quarters had been demolished in the early 20th century, but Dr. Okonkwo pointed out the foundations, still visible as depressions in the grass. "There were approximately 60 enslaved people living here at the peak," he said. "Families, children, elderly people. They built this place, they maintained it, they made the Barksdales wealthy, and now they are invisible." Eleanor showed him the daguerreotype on her phone. He studied it for a long time. "The companion system," he said finally. "It was more brutal than most people understand. White families did not assign enslaved children to their sons out of kindness. They did it to establish dominance from the earliest age. The white child learned that he owned another human being. The enslaved child learned that his body was not his own. The relationship was designed to normalize inequality, to make it feel natural and inevitable." He pointed to the chain. "This is evidence of what happened when the system did not work as intended, when an enslaved child refused to submit, when he maintained some sense of his own humanity and autonomy. The response was not persuasion or education. It was physical restraint. It was violence." Eleanor asked about other examples. Were there other photographs showing enslaved children in restraints? "Not that have been identified," Dr. Okonkwo said, "but that does not mean they do not exist. The chain in this image is almost invisible. If you had not looked closely, you would have missed it entirely. How many other images are sitting in archives, in family collections, in museums with similar details that no one has noticed?" He paused. "The photograph was meant to tell one story: happy childhood, benevolent slavery. The chain tells a different story: resistance and repression. The question is, which story will institutions choose to tell?" Eleanor returned to the Barksdale papers with new focus. She wanted to trace Clayborne's life as far as the records would allow. The letters and ledgers provided fragmentary glimpses. In 1856, Martha Barksdale noted that Claybornne had been severely disciplined after another escape attempt. In 1858, he was listed in an inventory as sound but scarred. In 1860, William Barksdale, now 16, left for the University of Virginia. Claybornne went with him, still bound to his service. When the war began in 1861, William enlisted in the Confederate Army. The records did not indicate what happened to Claybornne. Some enslaved body servants accompanied their masters to the front. Others were left behind. Some escaped to Union lines when the opportunity arose. Eleanor found a clue in an unexpected place: A collection of letters from African American soldiers serving in the United States colored troops had been digitized by the National Archives. One letter, dated August 1864, was from a soldier named Claybornne Randolph serving with the 5th Regiment, USCT. The letter was addressed to a Freedmen's Aid Society in Philadelphia. It read, in part, "I was born in bondage in Virginia and was made to serve a white boy from the age of 6. I wore his chain until I was 18 years old. Now I wear the uniform of the United States, and I fight so that no child will ever wear such a chain again. I have taken my true name, Randolph, from the estate where I was born. The name Claybornne I keep, for it was given to me by my mother, who I never saw again after I was sold." Eleanor read the letter several times. Claybornne had escaped. He had made it to Union territory. He had enlisted, taken up arms against the Confederacy, and fought for the freedom of others. The boy in the daguerreotype, the one who had refused to submit, who had tried to run again and again, who had been chained and scarred, had survived. He had resisted. He had won. She searched for more records. The military service files showed that Claybornne Randolph had served until the end of the war. He had been present at the siege of Petersburg and the fall of Richmond. After the war, he had settled in Ohio, where he worked as a blacksmith. Census records from 1870 showed him living in Cleveland with a wife named Sarah and 2 children. He had built a life. He had made a family. He had turned his skills, perhaps learned in bondage, perhaps learned in war, into a livelihood. The chain had not broken him, but the photograph remained. And it still told the wrong story. Eleanor brought her findings to the director of the Virginia Historical Society. His name was Thomas Whitfield, and he had led the institution for 12 years. He was a careful administrator, attentive to donors and board members, cautious about controversy. She laid out the evidence, the daguerreotype, the documentation, the chain, the family letters, Claybornne's later life. She proposed that the society create a new exhibition centered on companion portraits, reframing these images as evidence of coercion rather than affection. The Barksdale daguerreotype would be the centerpiece. Whitfield listened carefully. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This is important work," he said, "but I have concerns." He explained. The Barksdale family, though diminished, still had living descendants. Several were significant donors to the society. One sat on the board. The family had contributed materials, money, and influence over many decades. They expected their ancestors to be presented in a favorable light. "I am not saying we cannot do this," Whitfield said, "but we need to consider the implications. We need to prepare the board. We need to anticipate the reaction." Eleanor had expected this. She had worked at the society long enough to understand its institutional culture. Donors mattered, relationships mattered, history was important, but so was funding. "The evidence is clear," she said. "We have a photograph that shows an enslaved child in restraints. We have documentation that explains why. We have records of his resistance and his eventual freedom. This is exactly the kind of story we should be telling. It is exactly the kind of story people need to hear." Whitfield nodded. "I agree. But we need to do this carefully. Let me talk to the board. Let me prepare the ground." The board meeting took place 3 weeks later. Eleanor was not invited to attend, but Whitfield briefed her afterward. The discussion had been contentious. Several board members, including the Barksdale descendant, had expressed strong reservations. They argued that the interpretation was speculative, that the chain might have been decorative, that the family letters might have been exaggerated. They worried about legal liability, about donor relations, about the society's reputation. Others had pushed back. One board member, a retired history professor, had called the evidence compelling and the interpretation sound. Another, a civil rights attorney, had argued that the society had an obligation to tell the truth about slavery, even when that truth was uncomfortable. The debate had gone on for 2 hours. In the end, the board had reached a compromise. The society would proceed with a small exhibition, but the Barksdale family would be consulted before anything was made public. The chain would be mentioned, but the interpretation would be framed as one possible reading among several. The word restraint would not appear in the exhibition text. Eleanor was furious. "It is not one possible reading," she said. "It is the only reading that fits the evidence. The family letters explicitly describe the chain. The photographer's records mention restraints. We are not speculating. We are documenting. Whitfield was sympathetic, but firm. This is what the board approved. If you want to go further, you will need to find another venue. Eleanor considered her options. She could accept the compromise and hope the exhibition would at least start a conversation. She could resign in protest and try to publish her findings independently, or she could find allies who might help her apply pressure from outside. She chose the third option. Dr. Foster at Howard University had connections to journalists who covered issues of historical memory and racial justice. Dr. Okonkwo had relationships with community organizations that advocated for more honest representations of slavery at historic sites. Together, they helped Eleanor assemble a coalition of scholars, activists, and descendants who could speak to the importance of the daguerreotype. The key addition to the coalition was someone Eleanor had not expected to find, a descendant of Claybornne Randolph. His name was Marcus Randolph. He was a retired teacher living in Cleveland, the same city where Claybornne had settled after the war. His family had preserved stories about their ancestor, stories that had been passed down through generations. They knew about the white boy he had been forced to serve. They knew about the chains. They knew about his escape and his military service. But they had never seen the photograph. When Eleanor showed Marcus the daguerreotype, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "That is my great-great-grandfather. And that chain is not decoration. That chain is evidence. The Barksdales put that chain on him, and they need to own that. This photograph belongs to my family as much as it belongs to theirs. And we want the truth to be told." The coalition sent a letter to the Virginia Historical Society's board, signed by 24 scholars and community leaders, calling for a full and honest exhibition. They cited the documentation, the family letters, the photographer's records. They emphasized that Claybornne Randolph had living descendants who wanted their ancestors' story told accurately. The letter was followed by media coverage. A journalist from a national newspaper wrote a story about the daguerreotype and the controversy surrounding its interpretation. The article included quotes from Eleanor, Dr. Foster, Dr. Okonkwo, and Marcus Randolph. It also included a response from the Barksdale descendant on the board, who called the interpretation politically motivated and disrespectful to history. The publicity forced the board to reconsider. A second meeting was held, this time with Eleanor present. She made her case again, now supported by the weight of outside attention. The Barksdale descendant, a woman named Catherine Barksdale Wright, spoke in opposition. "My family has supported this institution for generations," she said. "We have donated materials, funded programs, served on this board, and now we are being accused of cruelty based on speculation about a piece of jewelry in an old photograph," Eleanor responded quietly. "Mrs. Barksdale Wright, your ancestors' letters describe the chain. She wrote that Claybornne was kept in restraints because he refused to submit. Those are her words, not mine. I am not accusing anyone. I am reading the documents your family preserved." The room was silent. The vote was called. The board approved a revised exhibition plan by a margin of 7-4. The chain would be identified explicitly as a restraint. Clayborne's story would be told in full, from his purchase as a child through his escape and military service. The Randolph family would be consulted on the exhibition text and invited to the opening. Catherine Barksdale Wright resigned from the board that evening. The exhibition opened 6 months later. It was titled "Seen and Unseen: Slavery in American Photography." The Barksdale daguerreotype was displayed in the center of the gallery, enlarged and accompanied by detailed text explaining what the image showed and what it concealed. Visitors could see the chain clearly in the enlargement. They could read excerpts from Martha Barksdale's letters. They could follow Clayborne's journey from bondage to freedom, from enslaved child to Union soldier to Cleveland blacksmith. They could see photographs of his descendants, including Marcus Randolph, standing in the same gallery where their ancestor's image was displayed. The exhibition also included other companion portraits from the Society's collection, reinterpreted through the lens of Eleanor's research. Labels that had once described these images as evidence of affection between the races were replaced with more accurate language about coercion, control, and the systematic destruction of black childhood. Marcus Randolph spoke at the opening. He stood in front of the daguerreotype, looking at the image of his ancestor, and addressed the crowd. "My family has known this story for generations," he said. "We knew about the chains. We knew about the escape. We knew about the war. But we never had the picture. We never had the proof. Now we do. And I want to thank the people who fought to make sure this photograph would be shown honestly. My great-great-grandfather was not a companion. He was not a friend. He was a prisoner. He was a child in chains. And he broke those chains. He ran. He fought. He won. That is the story this picture tells, and it is a story that belongs to all of us." Eleanor watched from the back of the room. She had spent nearly 2 years on this project, from the moment she first noticed the chain to the opening night of the exhibition. She had faced resistance from her own institution, from donors, from a board that wanted to protect its relationships more than tell the truth. But she had also found allies, scholars who cared about historical accuracy, community members who demanded honest representation, descendants who had waited generations to see their ancestor acknowledged. The exhibition ran for 18 months. It drew record attendance and significant media coverage. Schools brought students on field trips. Community groups organized discussions. Researchers from other institutions came to study the materials and methodology. The Barksdale family did not attend. Catherine Barksdale Wright gave an interview to a local newspaper criticizing the exhibition as one-sided and designed to shame white families. But her objections did not gain traction. The evidence was too strong. The chain was too visible. Other institutions took notice. A museum in South Carolina requested permission to include the daguerreotype in a traveling exhibition about enslaved children. A university in Georgia asked Eleanor to consult on a project to reinterpret their own collection of antebellum photographs. A documentary filmmaker began developing a project about companion portraits and the hidden history they revealed. The photograph that had sat unseen in a leather case for more than a century was now being studied, discussed, and taught. The boy in the chain was no longer invisible. Old photographs are never neutral. They were made by people with purposes, composed according to conventions, preserved because someone thought they mattered. What they show is always partial. What they hide is often more important. For decades, companion portraits were read as evidence of something benign. White families kept them in albums and passed them down through generations. Museums displayed them without comment or with labels that emphasized harmony and affection. The enslaved children in these images were rarely named, rarely identified, rarely acknowledged as anything other than props in someone else's family story. The Barksdale daguerreotype changed that, but it was only one image. Across the country, in archives and attics, in museum collections and antique shops, there are thousands of similar photographs. Images where the composition suggests friendship, but the context suggests bondage. Images where small details, a hand position, a collar, a shadow, might reveal something the photographer never intended to show. Eleanor continued her work after the exhibition closed. She developed a guide for curators and archivists, outlining what to look for when examining 19th-century photographs that included enslaved or formerly enslaved subjects. She trained staff at other institutions. She gave lectures and published articles. She helped build a community of researchers committed to looking more carefully at images that had been accepted for too long at face value. She also stayed in touch with Marcus Randolph. He visited Richmond several times, meeting with staff at the Historical Society, speaking to community groups, and standing before the daguerreotype of his ancestor. Each time, he said the same thing. He was a boy in chains, and he became a man who broke them. That is a story worth remembering. The photograph remains in the collection of the Virginia Historical Society, now displayed with full documentation. Visitors who see it know what they are looking at. They know about the chain. They know about Clayborne's resistance and his escape. They know about his military service and his life after the war. They know about his descendants who are still here, still remembering, still telling the story. And they know that this image, which looked so charming at first glance, was never really about friendship. It was about power. It was about ownership. It was about the systematic destruction of black childhood in the service of white privilege. The chain was meant to be invisible. The story was meant to be forgotten. But someone looked closely. Someone asked questions. Someone refused to accept the easy reading. And now, 170 years later, the truth is finally visible. The boy in the photograph has a name. He has a story. He has descendants who carry his memory forward. And the chain around his neck, once hidden by fabric and shadow, is now the most important thing in the frame. It is a reminder that history is not what happened. It is what we choose to see.